The Montana sky was a thing of cruel and boundless beauty. It stretched from one jagged horizon to the other, an endless canvas of blue so deep it was almost violet, painted with the thin, white brushstrokes of high clouds. Beneath it, the land rolled on forever, a sea of prairie grass that rippled and swayed with the ceaseless wind. The wind was the territory's true master. It was born in the distant teeth of the mountains, a cold, clean breath that gathered strength as it scoured the plains, whispering through the buffalo grass, howling through the rock-strewn coulees, and rattling the very soul of any man foolish enough to build his life in its path. It was a constant, scouring presence, a reminder of the world's vast indifference. This was the world Elias Thorne had chosen for himself. His ranch was a lonely outpost, a small collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings huddled against the immensity of the landscape. The cabin, the barn, the corrals, all were built with a grim, functional purpose, with no thought given to comfort or aesthetics. They were structures meant to endure, not to welcome. They were a reflection of the man himself. Elias, a man in his late 30s, moved through this world with a stiffness that went beyond his years. A pronounced limp in his left leg, a permanent souvenir from a piece of shrapnel at Shiloh, dictated the rhythm of his life. Each step was a quiet, measured act of will, a constant, dull ache that served as a tether to a past he had crossed a continent to forget. His face was a roadmap of hardship, carved by the sun and the wind, his skin the texture of old leather. But it was his eyes that told the truest story. They were the color of a winter sky, gray and distant, and they held a deep, settled weariness. They were the eyes of a man who had witnessed the very worst of what men could do to one another, and now wished only for the quiet simplicity of the empty land. His days were governed by a methodical efficiency, a ritual of chores that began before the sun and ended long after it had bled away behind the mountains. He mended fences, tended his small herd of cattle, and cared for his horses with a grim focus. His only companions the lowing of the livestock and the sprawling, silent expanse that surrounded him. Solitude was not a punishment for Elias. It was a fortress. He had built its walls high and thick, stone by stone. With every memory he refused to speak and every connection he refused to make. It was a life of his own careful construction, designed to keep the world, with all its noise and complications, at bay. On a day in late spring, when the last of the winter snow had finally retreated to the high country and the first green shoots were pushing through the cold earth, the world shifted. The change came with a shocking speed. The morning had been clear and sharp, but by midday, a strange, bruised purple-gray began to stain the western horizon. The wind, usually a steady, impersonal force, took on a new voice. It began to moan, then to shriek, a raw, grieving sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the sky. Elias felt the change in his bones, in the familiar ache of his leg. He looked to the west and his weathered face tightened. He had seen skies like that before. It was a blizzard, a late-season monster, coming on with a speed and fury that could kill a man caught unprepared. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. He moved with a frantic, limping urgency, his every action precise and calculated. He drove the cattle from the open pasture into the relative shelter of a shallow ravine, their protests lost in the rising gale. He herded his horses into the barn, their eyes wide with fear as the first snowflakes, hard and sharp as pellets of ice, began to drive down from the sky. The world dissolved into a churning, blinding tempest of white. The snow did not fall, it flew sideways, a horizontal wall of stinging ice that stole the breath and scoured the skin. The wind howled like a legion of damned souls, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sound. Elias fought his way from the corrals to the barn, leaning into the gale, his hat pulled low, a kerchief tied over his nose and mouth. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that seeped through his heavy coat and settled deep into his marrow. He was making a final check on the barn door, ensuring the heavy wooden bar was secure, when he saw it. Through the blinding swirl of snow, just at the edge of his vision, was a dark shape. It was a heap against the rapidly accumulating drifts, a smudge of black against the world's sudden, violent whiteness. His first thought was of a wolf, driven down from the mountains by the storm, or perhaps a calf that had been separated from the herd. He paused, his body tensed, and slowly, deliberately, his hand went to the Colt revolver holstered on his hip. He drew the pistol, its cold, familiar weight a small comfort in the chaos, and began to move cautiously toward the shape. The wind tore at him, trying to push him back, and the snow stung his eyes, but he kept moving, his gaze locked on the dark form. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself, and the breath caught in his throat. It was not an animal. It was a person, a woman. He found her lying in a heap, half buried in the snow. She was barely conscious, her skin a deathly, translucent pale, her lips tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. She was dressed in what had once been a fine white wedding gown. The delicate lace and silk were torn and shredded, stained with the brown of mud and the shocking, brilliant crimson of blood. Her dark hair was a tangled, matted mess around her face, and a deep, ugly gash on her forehead was the source of much of the bleeding, the blood having frozen in dark rivulets on her temple. Elias knelt beside her, the cold of the snow seeping through the knees of his trousers. The pistol felt heavy and useless in his hand. He holstered it and reached out, his gloved hand tentatively touching her shoulder. At his touch, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and for a fleeting moment, they were filled with a raw, primal terror that struck him to the core. Her cracked, blue lips parted, and a sound, barely a whisper, escaped on a puff of white vapor. "Help me, please," she moaned, the words a fragile plea against the storm's fury. And then her eyes rolled back, and she succumbed to the encroaching darkness of unconsciousness. The world seemed to stop. The howling of the wind, the biting cold, the driving snow, it all faded into a dull roar in the back of his mind. Elias was thrown into a state of intense, violent internal conflict. Every instinct, every habit honed by years of self-imposed isolation screamed at him, "Leave her. Walk away. This is not your concern." He had built his fortress to keep this exact thing out. Trouble. The world of men and their laws, their passions, and their violence. He saw the fine quality of the dress, even in its ruined state. This was not a homesteader's daughter or a saloon girl. She was from a world of wealth and power, a world that had no place on his remote piece of land. Bringing her into his cabin was like bringing in a lit stick of dynamite. But as he stared down at her fragile, broken form, another voice, one he had tried for years to silence, rose from the depths of his memory. It was the voice of the battlefield, the ghost of Shiloh. He saw the faces of the men he had left behind, their eyes pleading, their voices lost in the cannon fire and the screams. He had survived by walking away, by becoming hard, by shutting out the world. But the guilt of it, the memory of those he could not save, was a cancer in his soul, a constant companion in the long, dark hours of his nightmares. He looked at the woman. He looked at the blood on the snow. He heard her whispered plea echo in his mind. He could not do it. He could not leave another soul to die in the wilderness. With a groan that was part physical effort and part spiritual agony, he holstered his pistol and carefully scooped her into his arms. The feel of her was utterly alien to him. She was so light, so fragile and cold, a bird with a broken wing. He held her tight against his chest, trying to shield her from the wind, and began the arduous journey back to the cabin. The storm fought him every step of the way, but he pushed on, driven by a reluctant, unfamiliar sense of duty. He stumbled through the door of his cabin, kicking it shut against the tempest. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the storm's roar. He carried her through the small, Spartan room and laid her down on his own cot. The interior of his home was meticulously, almost unnervingly clean. The floorboards were scrubbed, the few tin plates and cups were stacked neatly, and there was not a speck of dust to be seen, but it was a space utterly devoid of softness or comfort. There were no curtains on the single window, no rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was the living space of a man who expected nothing from life and gave nothing back. On his cot, the stark, blood-stained white of her ruined dress was a shocking, jarring intrusion, a splash of chaos in his world of rigid order. For a long moment, he simply stood there, dripping snow onto the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, the soldier in him took over. He had a casualty, and she needed tending. He stoked the fire in the stone hearth until it roared to life, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. He filled a kettle with water and set it to boil. Then he turned his attention to the woman. His hands, usually rough and calloused from the hard labor of the ranch, became surprisingly gentle. He found a pair of shears and carefully, methodically, began to cut away the sodden, ruined fabric of the wedding dress. As he worked, he discovered other injuries. There were deep, ugly bruises on her upper arms and wrists, dark smudges on her pale skin that were shaped like gripping fingers. There was a cut on her swollen lip. These were not the wounds of an accidental fall. This was a deliberate, violent attack. A cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity. He cleaned the gush on her forehead with warm water and a clean rag, his touch as delicate as he could manage. He sterilized a needle and thread in the flame of a candle and, with the steady hand of a man who had done this grim work before, he stitched the wound closed. His stitches were small and neat. He bandaged the wound carefully with a strip of clean linen torn from one of his own few shirts. The intimacy of the situation was an unnerving, unwelcome thing. As he leaned over her, he could smell the scent of her rain-soaked hair, a faint floral fragrance that was utterly foreign in his world of leather, sweat, and wood smoke. He felt the soft, cool texture of her skin beneath his fingertips. It was a proximity to another human being that was both unsettling and profound, the closest he had been to anyone in almost a decade. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body shivering despite the warmth from the fire. In her delirium, she began to mutter, the words fragmented and feverish. She spoke in a tumble of both English and Spanish, her voice small and lost. Elias leaned closer, trying to make sense of her words. He heard mentions of a judge, a cold, cruel voice. He heard the word property, spoken with a tone of fear and revulsion. He heard of a cold, cruel touch that made her skin crawl. Elias listened, his face a grim, unreadable mask. A dark understanding began to form in his mind, the pieces of a terrible story clicking into place. He gently pulled his woolen blankets over her, covering her completely. He found his heaviest buffalo hide and laid that over her as well. Then he pulled a wooden chair close to the cot and sat down to keep vigil. Outside, the blizzard raged, a wild and untamed force of nature. Inside, the fire crackled and hissed, a small beacon of warmth against the cold. Elias sat and watched the woman, the storm in his own soul a quiet but perfect mirror of the chaos she had brought into his life. He stoked the fire, listened to her fevered whispers, and waited. In the dead of night, as the storm reached its peak, she cried out. It was not a moan, but a sharp, terrified scream that ripped through the quiet cabin and jolted Elias from his light doze. He was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed to her side to find her caught in the grips of a violent nightmare. She was thrashing against the heavy blankets, her hands batting at some unseen foe, her breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. His first instinct, the soldier's instinct, was to restrain her, to hold her down until the fit passed. But he stopped himself. He saw the sheer terror on her face in the flickering firelight, and something inside him shifted. He instinctively reached out, not to restrain, but to comfort. He gently, but firmly, placed his large, calloused hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough and gravelly from disuse. "You're safe here." His touch was firm, steady, an anchor in her sea of terror. The effect was immediate. Her thrashing subsided. Her body went still beneath his hand. Her eyes flew open, wide and dark with fear. and they locked onto his. In the dancing firelight, she stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. She saw not an aggressor, not another threat in the darkness, but something else. She saw a guardian, a protector. He did not pull his hand away. He simply kept it there, a silent, powerful promise. For the first time, she did not flinch from a man's touch. The terror in her eyes slowly receded, replaced by a dawning awareness, a fragile, hesitant understanding. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a slow, glistening path down her temple into her dark hair. In that shared moment of quiet intensity, with the storm howling its grief outside the cabin walls, the first fragile, invisible thread of trust was spun between two deeply wounded and solitary souls. The blizzard broke as violently as it had arrived. For 3 days, the world had been a formless, howling whiteness. On the 4th morning, Elias awoke to a profound and unnerving silence. He rose from the hard wooden chair where he had kept his vigil and looked out the small cabin window. The world was reborn, encased in a layer of snow so thick and pristine it seemed to have swallowed all sound, all color, all life. The sun, a pale disk in a washed-out blue sky, cast a light so bright it was blinding, making the endless drifts glitter as if seeded with diamonds. It was a landscape of savage, untouchable beauty, a clean slate wiped by the hand of a brutal god. Inside the cabin, life returned at a much slower, more cautious pace. Serafina, as he would learn she was called, slowly recovered from the brink of death. The fever broke, and the color began to return to her cheeks, a faint blush of rose against the pallor of her skin. But she remained watchful, a wild creature brought unwillingly to shelter. Her body was constantly tensed for flight, her dark eyes following his every movement with a wary, assessing gaze. In those first few days, the initial terror that had haunted her began to recede, replaced by a hesitant, silent curiosity. She watched him from the cot, a still and quiet observer of his life's rigid rhythm. His world, which had been built on a foundation of predictable solitude, became a source of comfort for her, a predictable pattern in a life that had become terrifyingly random. She learned the small, unspoken details of his existence. She learned that he drank his coffee black and scalding hot, swallowing it down as if it were a punishment rather than a pleasure. She learned to anticipate the slight favor he gave his left leg, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when he put his full weight on it. She learned to recognize the long, quiet moments when he would stand by the window, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains, his expression unreadable, his mind 1,000 miles away. He was a man of few words and even fewer movements, his quiet competence a steady, comforting beat in the heart of the silent cabin. As her strength returned, Serafina began to stir. She could not remain idle. It was not in her nature. She started with small, unobtrusive acts. While he was outside tending to the livestock, she would straighten the heavy wool blankets on his cot, folding them with a neatness that matched his own. She organized his meager pantry, arranging the tins of beans and sacks of flour into orderly rows on the rough-hewn shelves. One afternoon, she noticed a long tear in the shoulder of his canvas workshirt, which he had hung on a peg by the door. Finding a small sewing kit among her own few salvaged possessions, she sat by the fire, her fingers moving with a practiced skill, and repaired the tear with small, almost invisible stitches. These were simple acts of domesticity, but in the stark, masculine emptiness of Elias's cabin, they were transformative. They brought a subtle warmth, a whisper of life and care that the space had never known. Elias noticed. He would return from the cold to find the blankets folded, a sense of order in his pantry that was not his own, the unexpected neatness of the mended tear in his shirt. The changes filled him with a strange, unsettling feeling, a warmth that spread through his chest and was entirely unwelcome. It was a breach in his fortress walls, a softening of the hard edges he had spent years cultivating. One morning, while sweeping the floor, he found a small white handkerchief tucked into a corner near the cot. It was made of fine linen, and in one corner, a delicate blue flower had been embroidered with exquisite skill. He knew it was hers. He picked it up, the fabric impossibly soft and light in his rough hand. His first instinct was to return it to her, but he hesitated. He looked over at her, where she sat quietly by the fire, and then he looked back at the handkerchief. Instead of returning it, he walked to a small wooden box on his mantel, a box where he kept the few mementos of his former life, a tarnished medal, a tintype of his parents, a handful of letters. He opened the box, placed the small embroidered handkerchief inside, and closed the lid. It was a silent, secret admission, a testament to the space she was beginning to occupy not just in his home, but in his life. Their communication was sparse, born of necessity and caution, but as the days passed, it began to grow, like a stubborn plant pushing its way through hard-packed earth. He learned her name was Serafina. She learned his was Elias. They were simple facts, exchanged quietly across the small space of the cabin, but they were the first true stones laid in the foundation of a connection. One evening, nearly a week after the storm, the unspoken questions that hung between them finally found a voice. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Elias sat in his chair, cleaning his rifle, the methodical click and slide of the metal parts a familiar rhythmic sound. Serafina sat on a small stool opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap. She finally found the strength to tell him her story. She spoke in a low, pained voice, her gaze fixed on the flames as if the words were too heavy to be spoken while looking another person in the eye. She told him of being an orphan, her mother having died in childbirth, raised by the stern, unloving nuns in a convent. Her only inheritance, she explained, was a sizable piece of land, a fertile valley her father had worked his entire life to cultivate and protect. It was all she had of him, a tangible link to a man she barely remembered. Then she spoke the name that was a blight on her soul, Judge Alistair Croft. She described him as a man of immense power in the territory, a man with a fearsome reputation for piety and iron-fisted justice. His ranch bordered her land, and he coveted her valley with a greedy, all-consuming hunger. He wanted it to expand his own growing empire. He had arranged a marriage, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was not a courtship, it was a transaction, a business deal brokered with the local authorities, one that she, a young woman with no family and no protector, was powerless to stop. She detailed the chilling, suffocating events of her wedding day. She spoke of Croft's proprietary air, the way he looked at her not with affection, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a man examining a new horse. She described the feel of his cold, dry hands on hers, the possessive grip that made her skin crawl. She recounted his whispered threats, his promises of what would happen if she ever displeased him. Then, the unholy truth began to spill out, the words coming in a raw, ragged torrent. She told of the moment he had gotten her alone, just after the ceremony. His respectable, pious facade had crumbled away, revealing a monster of possessive cruelty. His violence, she explained, her voice trembling, was not an act of sudden, uncontrolled rage. It was a cold, deliberate, methodical effort to break her spirit, to demonstrate his absolute ownership of her. She was his property now, he had told her, no different from the land he had just acquired. She fled in the chaos of the wedding reception, running blindly, her only thought to escape the man who saw her not as a wife, but as a title deed. She ran into the wilderness, into the face of the oncoming storm, with no destination, no plan, only a desperate, primal need to be free. Elias had stopped cleaning his rifle. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the cold steel of the barrel, listening to her story. As she spoke, he felt a cold, familiar anger settle deep in his gut. It was a righteous, diamond-hard fury, the same anger he had felt on the battlefields of the war when he had witnessed a good man cut down by a senseless order, or a town plundered by men who had lost their souls. It was the anger of a man who understood injustice on a visceral level. When she fell silent, The only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire and the soft, ragged sound of her breathing. After a long moment, Elias, in turn, offered a small, broken piece of himself. He spoke briefly of the war, his voice low and flat. He did not speak of battles or glory, of courage or cowardice. He spoke of the crushing, overwhelming loss. He spoke of the moment he had realized that the world was a far more broken and cruel place than he had ever imagined. He told her how he had come to this empty land to escape the ghosts of his past, both the men he had killed and, more importantly, the men he had been unable to save. In the flickering firelight, they looked at each other. Two different kinds of outcasts, two survivors of different wars. They did not need to speak of the scars they carried. They recognized them in each other's souls. In the shared crucible of their past traumas, a profound and unspoken bond was forged between them. The practicalities of survival soon intruded on their fragile peace. The storm had lasted for days, and their supplies were running dangerously low. The flour sack was nearly empty, the coffee was gone, and the salt was running out. Elias knew he could not put it off any longer. He had to risk a trip to the nearby town of Redemption. The thought filled him with a cold dread. The town was a place he avoided at all costs, but there was no choice. He spent the morning preparing. He checked the harnesses for his wagon team and loaded a few hides to trade. Before he left, he went back into the cabin. He took down the Winchester rifle that rested on pegs above the door and handed it to Serafina. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, his voice gruff. She shook her head, her eyes wide as she looked at the heavy weapon. "You keep it pointed away from yourself," he said, his voice softening slightly as he showed her how to work the loading mechanism and the trigger. "You stay away from the window. You don't open this door for anyone, not for any reason. Do you understand?" She nodded, clutching the rifle in her hands. It felt cold and heavy, a terrifying weight of responsibility. "I will be back before dark," he said. It was a solemn promise. The town of Redemption was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together on the vast open prairie, as if seeking comfort from the sheer emptiness of the surrounding land. It was a place built on a foundation of gossip, suspicion, and a rigid, unforgiving social order. As Elias drove his wagon down the muddy main street, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Curtains twitched in windows. Men stopped their conversations to watch him pass. He was the town hermit, the strange, scarred soldier who kept to himself. His solitude was seen not as a choice, but as a sign of some dark, hidden secret. He tied his wagon in front of the general store and went inside. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, tobacco, and dried goods. The store owner, a portly man with a perpetually suspicious expression, greeted him with a curt nod. As Elias began to gather the supplies he needed, the whispers started. He could hear them from the small group of men gathered around the pot-bellied stove, a low, venomous murmur that slithered through the air. He heard the name Judge Croft. He heard the words missing bride. He heard the word award. His blood ran cold. He kept his face impassive, continuing to load his basket with flour, salt, and coffee, but his every nerve was on high alert. Just as he was about to pay, the town sheriff pushed his way through the door. Sheriff Brody was a tall, thin man with a cruel mouth and a tin star that was clearly a badge of allegiance to the most powerful man in the county. Not to the law. He was a man who was on Judge Croft's payroll, and the entire town knew it. Brody cornered Elias near the counter, his posture deliberately intimidating. "Thorne," he said, his voice laced with false cordiality. "Good to see you. We were just talking about you." "Were you?" Elias said, his voice flat. "The judge was through here a couple of days ago," Brody continued, his eyes narrowing. "Seems his new bride took a fright, ran off into the storm. A delicate, hysterical thing," he said. "He's offering a mighty handsome reward for any information on her whereabouts." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You were holed up during that storm, I imagine. Didn't see anything unusual out your way, did you?" The entire store had fallen silent. Every eye was on Elias. The air was thick and suffocating, A blanket of collective prejudice. He was the outsider, the strange one. He was an easy target for their blame. "I saw a lot of snow," Elias said, his voice curt. He paid the store owner, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "That's all you saw?" Brody pressed, taking a step closer. Elias met the sheriff's gaze, his own eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "That's all," he said. He picked up his sacks of supplies and, without another word, turned and walked out of the store, the weight of their suspicion like a physical blow against his back. He returned to the ranch under the cover of a deep purple dusk, his wagon filled with flour, salt, and a gnawing, bone-deep sense of dread. The world had shrunk. The vast, empty landscape that had once been his refuge now felt like a cage, and the walls were closing in. The town was against them. The law was against them. They were utterly, completely alone. He unloaded the supplies, his mind racing. As he reached into the last sack, his fingers brushed against a small, brightly colored tin. He had bought it on an impulse, a small act of defiance against the grim reality of their situation. It was a tin of fine sewing needles, along with a spool of vibrant, crimson-red thread. He took it into the cabin and handed it to Serafina. It was a simple, practical gift, but it was the first gift she had received in her life that was not part of a transaction, that was not given with an expectation of something in return. She took the small tin from him, her eyes wide. She looked from the tin to his face and then back again, a look of such stunned, disbelieving gratitude on her face that it made Elias's heart ache with an emotion he could not name. That night, the weight of their new reality hung heavy and suffocating in the small cabin. The fire crackled and hissed, casting long, menacing shadows on the rough log walls. The wind had picked up again, moaning around the eaves of the cabin like a restless spirit. Serafina sat on her stool by the hearth, mending the tattered remains of her wedding dress with the new red thread. Her stitches were small and precise, a line of defiant color against the stained, ruined white of the fabric. Elias sat in his chair, watching her. He was mesmerized by the quiet grace of her movements, the focused intensity of her expression in the flickering firelight. This simple domestic scene, a woman mending a dress by the fire, was infused with a profound and dangerous beauty that stole the breath from his lungs. In that moment, he was struck by a realization that was as terrifying as it was undeniable. The thought of her leaving, of her being found and taken away, of his life returning to its previous state of gray, empty solitude, was utterly and completely unbearable. The fortress he had built around his heart had been breached, and he was defenseless against the woman who now resided within its walls. He rose from his chair, the scraping of the wood on the floorboards startlingly loud in the quiet room. He crossed the small space and sat on a wooden crate opposite her. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer awkward or cautious. It was filled with a powerful, unspoken current of emotion, a palpable thing that hummed in the air between them. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he reached out his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, scarred and weathered by war and hard labor. It trembled slightly as it moved through the air. He gently, tentatively, came to rest his palm on her cheek. His touch was shockingly gentle, a stark contrast to the roughness of his skin. At his touch, she went perfectly still. A small, sharp breath escaped her lips. Then, she leaned into his palm, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a complete and total surrender. Her eyes closed for a brief second, and in that small, simple gesture, he saw a universe of trust and acceptance. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a silent, solemn acknowledgement of the deep, terrifying, and beautiful thing that was growing between them in the heart of the wilderness. It was a promise of protection. It was a confession of a desire so intense and so profound it frightened them both to their very souls. The fragile peace that had settled over the ranch was as thin and delicate as a layer of morning frost, and it was shattered just as easily, in the opulent, wood-paneled study of his sprawling estate. Judge Alistair Croft paced like a caged wolf, his patience worn to a raw, bleeding edge. Serafina's disappearance was not just an inconvenience, it was an intolerable act of defiance, an insult to his power and his authority. He had purchased her, body and soul, and the idea that his property had simply walked away was a source of constant, seething rage. He would not tolerate it. He dispatched 2 of his most trusted and ruthless men, instruments of his will who operated outside the flimsy constraints of the law. Their names were Cale and Marcus, and their reputation preceded them across the territory, a whispered litany of broken bones and extinguished lives. Cale was a former Pinkerton agent, a man Croft had hired for his sharp, analytical mind and his complete lack of a moral compass. He was a tracker, not just of men, but of their weaknesses. He was wiry and thin-lipped, with pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing. Marcus was his opposite, a mountain of a man, a brutish enforcer whose only language was violence. His hands were the size of small hams, and he moved with a sullen, ponderous grace that was deceptively fast. Together, they were methodical and cruel, a perfect extension of the judge's cold, possessive heart. They began their search with a chilling efficiency, working their way outward from the site of the wedding reception. They shook down homesteads, their questions polite but laced with an undeniable menace. They interrogated trappers and traders, their presence alone enough to loosen tongues and sow a creeping fear across the land. They were not lawmen. They were something older and more terrifying, the personal hounds of a powerful man, and they were utterly relentless. It was Cale, with his sharp, predatory eyes, who found the first real clue. He was scouring a ravine a few miles from the edge of Elias Thorne's property, a place where a person fleeing in a storm might have sought shelter. He was about to move on when a small, incongruous detail caught his eye. Snagged on the thorns of a gnarled greasewood bush was a tiny, mud-caked fragment of fabric. He dismounted and carefully worked it free. He brushed the dried mud from it with his thumb, revealing the intricate, delicate pattern of fine Belgian lace. It was a piece torn from a wedding dress, a small, damning piece of evidence left behind in a frantic, desperate escape. Cale looked up from the scrap of lace, his gaze sweeping across the rolling hills to the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney of the distant, isolated cabin. Elias Thorne, the quiet, reclusive veteran with the limp and the haunted eyes. Sheriff Brody had mentioned his curt, evasive answers. Cale permitted himself a small, cold smile. Their search had just found its focus. Elias Thorne was no longer just a person of interest. He was the prime suspect. Elias sensed the change in the world long before he saw it. It was a shift in the air, a new tension in the wind, the same feeling he used to get in the war just before an enemy charge. The fragile bubble of peace he and Serafina had built within the 4 walls of his cabin had been punctured. The outside world was coming for them. The quiet, methodical rancher, the man who found a grim comfort in the simple, repetitive tasks of his life, began to recede. In his place, the soldier emerged. It was a transformation that happened not in his actions, but in his eyes. They lost their distant, weary quality and became sharp, assessing, constantly scanning the horizon for threats. He no longer saw his land as a refuge, but as a battlefield. He assessed the lines of sight from the surrounding hills, the defensive advantages of the barn and the cabin, the blind spots where an enemy could approach unseen. He knew they could not simply hide and wait. Hiding was for prey. He had to prepare Serafina. He had to give her a weapon. One clear, cold morning, he took her to a secluded part of his land, a small, sheltered meadow hidden by a stand of tall pines. In his hands, he carried the heavy Winchester rifle. Serafina looked at the weapon with a mixture of fear and awe. It was a thing of cold, hard steel and polished wood, a tool made for one purpose: to kill. The scene that unfolded was one of charged and terrible intimacy. He stood behind her, his body close to hers, his presence a solid, warm wall at her back. He adjusted her stance, his hands on her shoulders, turning her slightly. "Your feet must be firm," he told her, his voice low and steady, close to her ear. the ground is your strength." He placed the rifle in her hands, his own hands guiding hers, showing her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder. The proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of wood smoke and clean winter air that clung to his clothes. He was so close she could feel the gentle rumble of his voice in his chest as he spoke. "Feel the weight of it," he instructed, his fingers wrapping around hers on the heavy barrel. "It is a part of you now. Respect it. Do not be afraid of it." For Serafina, the rifle was a symbol of the terrifying new reality she inhabited, a world where survival was measured by one's ability to inflict violence, but under his calm, steady instruction. The cold steel began to feel less like a threat and more like a tool, an extension of her own will. He showed her how to aim, how to line up the sights on a distant pine cone he had placed on a fence post. He taught her to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger slowly and smoothly. When she fired for the first time, the sound was a deafening crack that echoed through the silent woods. The recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, a hard, punishing blow that made her stagger back. The shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dirt far to the left of the target. She was shaken, her ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid in her nostrils. "Again," Elias said, his voice calm and unwavering. He stayed with her, patient and methodical, correcting her stance, adjusting her grip, and she learned. The fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, focused determination. On her 7th shot, she hit the pine cone. It exploded in a shower of woody fragments. A surge of fierce, unfamiliar pride flowed through her. It was a feeling of power, of agency, a realization that she was not helpless. She had drawn a line in the dirt, and she could defend it. The first confrontation happened 2 days later, on a cold, clear afternoon when the sun was a weak, watery presence in the vast sky. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, their forms dark and menacing against the snow-dusted landscape. Elias saw them long before they reached the ranch. He sent Serafina inside the cabin with the rifle and a single, quiet command: "Stay down." He met them on the porch. He did not carry a rifle or a pistol. In his right hand, he held a simple wood axe, its blade sharp and clean. He held it loosely, as if he had just been interrupted in the middle of chopping firewood. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his eyes were as cold and watchful as a hawk's. Cale and Marcus reined in their horses a respectful but threatening distance from the cabin. About 30 yards out, they sat their horses, studying him, the silence stretching out, thick with unspoken violence. It was Cale who finally broke the silence, his voice as smooth and pleasant as a river stone, and just as hard beneath the surface. "Elias Thorne?" he asked, though it was not a question. Elias said nothing. He just watched them. "My name is Cale," the man continued. "My associate is Marcus. We work for Judge Alistair Croft. I believe you may have heard of him." He paused. The judge is a man who values his property, and right now, he is missing a very valuable piece of it. His new bride, a dark-haired woman, young, pretty. She ran off during the recent storm. Cale's gaze was sharp, probing, trying to find a crack in Elias's impassive facade. Marcus remained silent, a hulking, silent threat. His hand rested casually, almost lazily, on the butt of the massive pistol holstered on his hip. His gaze was fixed on the cabin, his small, piggish eyes trying to peer through the single window. "The judge is offering a generous reward for her return," Cale said, his voice dropping slightly, "and he is known to be displeased with those who interfere in his personal business, the kind of displeasure that can make a man's life very difficult. You understand." Elias remained impassive, his expression unreadable. "I have seen no woman," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is private property. You have no business here." The tension in the air crackled, as sharp and cold as the winter air. Cale's pleasant demeanor hardened, the thin veneer of civility peeling away to reveal the predator beneath. "We have reason to believe you are not being truthful, Mr. Thorne," he said softly. "Perhaps you would not mind if my associate and I had a look inside your cabin, just to satisfy our curiosity. Elias took a single, slow step forward, moving from the porch to the top step. The wood axe shifted slightly in his grip, its polished blade catching a glint of the pale afternoon sun. "This is as far as you come," he said. His voice was quiet, almost a conversational tone, but it carried the deadly, unmistakable weight of a man who understood violence intimately, who had lived and breathed it, and who was not afraid of it. From inside the cabin, Serafina watched through a small crack in the curtains, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy Winchester was clutched tightly in her hands, the stock pressed against her shoulder, the barrel resting on the windowsill. Her hands were slick with sweat, but her resolve was firm. Cale studied Elias for a long, silent moment. He saw the stillness in the man's posture, the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. He saw not a simple, reclusive rancher, but something else, something far more dangerous. He recognized the look of a man who had been pushed to his limit and would not be broken by intimidation. He had found the woman's hiding place, but he had also found her protector. Cale gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Marcus. Without a word, they turned their horses and rode away, their departure as sudden and silent as their arrival. But the air they left behind was thick and heavy with the promise of their return. They would be back, and they would not be back alone. The siege was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. The moment the riders disappeared over the horizon, Elias and Serafina began to work. There was no discussion, no debate. They moved with a shared, unspoken understanding. The soldier had taken complete command. He directed them as they fortified the cabin, barricading the single window at night with the heavy wooden table, reinforcing the door with a thick iron bar he had forged in his smithy. They filled every available bucket and barrel with fresh water from the well. They took stock of their food, rationing it carefully, preparing for a long fight. The constant, suffocating threat created an environment of intense pressure. They were trapped together in the small cabin, their world reduced to this tiny, fragile fortress. Their shared fear and forced proximity acted as a crucible, burning away the last of their reticence and accelerating their emotional intimacy. They talked late into the night, their voices low whispers in the firelight. They found a strange, grim solace in sharing the dark, hidden corners of their pasts, the horrors they had faced alone becoming more bearable when spoken aloud to someone who truly understood. He spoke of the faces of the dead that haunted his sleep. She spoke of the suffocating loneliness of the convent. They were two broken pieces of two different worlds, but in this small, besieged cabin, they began to fit together. One night, the fragile control Serafina had maintained over her trauma finally broke. She cried out in her sleep, a sharp, whimpering sound of pure terror. Elias was at her side in an instant, his hand on her shoulder, his voice a low, comforting murmur in the darkness. She woke with a gasp, her body trembling, her face wet with tears. The nightmare had been too real, too vivid. Racked by sobs that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul, she confessed the final, most shameful piece of her story. It was the truth that she had buried the deepest, the one that poisoned her every waking thought. It was not just the land that Judge Croft had wanted, she whispered, her voice a broken, ragged thing. It was not just about the marriage or the property. It was about the act of possession itself, the complete and total subjugation of another human being. She revealed, with gut-wrenching sobs, what he had said to her on their wedding day. In the moments before she had fled, he had boasted, his voice cold and triumphant, about how he had engineered the accident that had killed her father all those years ago. A runaway wagon, a tragic mishap. The town had called it, but it had been no accident. Croft had arranged it all. It was, he had told her, the first necessary step in acquiring his property. Her escape, she cried, was not just from a violent husband. It was from the man who had murdered her family, the man who had stolen her past and was now intent on stealing her future. The monstrous, suffocating truth hung in the air between them, an obscene and terrible thing. Elias did not offer her empty words of comfort or hollow promises that everything would be all right. Instead, a cold, diamond-hard rage settled deep within him, a silent, murderous fury that burned away every last vestige of the weary, reclusive man he had once been. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she wept, absorbing her pain, her grief, her terror into himself. Her tears soaked the front of his rough wool shirt, a warm, wet stain over his heart. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering, exhausted breaths, he gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze in the dim, flickering light of the dying fire. His eyes bored into hers, filled with a terrifying and absolute certainty. "He will not have you," he vowed, his voice a low, guttural growl, the sound of a predator protecting its own. "I will die before he lays a hand on you again." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was not one of gentle romance or tender comfort. It was fierce, desperate, and possessive. It was a seal on his vow, a brand of ownership that was not about property, but about protection. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of righteous fury, and of a love that had been forged in the very heart of a tragedy. The days that followed the confrontation were a blur of tense, watchful waiting. Time seemed to slow and stretch, each hour laden with a heavy, unspoken dread. Elias and Serafina fell into a domestic rhythm dictated not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the impending threat that lay just over the horizon. They moved around the small, cramped cabin with a synchronized, unconscious grace, a silent understanding passing between them in the spaces where words were too inadequate. The simple, mundane acts of survival became freighted with a profound and unspoken emotion. Sharing a meal of biscuits and salted meat was no longer just about sustenance, it was a quiet communion, a shared moment of peace in a world bent on their destruction. The ritual of tending the fire, of Elias adding another log and Serafina sweeping the hearth, became a collaborative effort to keep a small flame of warmth and hope alive against the encroaching cold. The meticulous cleaning of the rifles was a grim sacrament, their hands moving over the cold steel and oiled wood with a focused intensity, a shared acknowledgement of the violence to come. Their love was not a thing of grand declarations or poetic verses. It was a quieter, stronger thing, evident in the language of their shared existence. It was in the way his eyes would follow her as she moved through the cabin, a look of fierce, protective tenderness in their gray depths. It was in the light, fleeting touch of her hand on his arm as she passed him, a small gesture of reassurance that spoke volumes. It was in the long, silent moments they would spend sitting by the fire, simply existing in each other's presence, drawing strength from their quiet solidarity. The isolation that had once been Elias's carefully constructed refuge had transformed. It was no longer a fortress to keep the world out, but a fortress to keep them safe, together. The small cabin had become their shared sanctuary, a tiny, defiant island of warmth and humanity in the midst of a vast and hostile world. While this quiet, fragile world was being built inside the cabin, a darker, more public world was being manipulated just a day's ride away. Judge Alistair Croft arrived in the town of Redemption, and his arrival cast a long, cold shadow over the dusty main street. He did not slink into town like a man with a secret. He arrived in a polished black carriage drawn by two magnificent black horses, a small entourage of grim-faced men riding alongside him. He was the very embodiment of power and corrupted authority, and his demeanor was a masterpiece of calculated deception. He was the grieving, wronged husband, his face a mask of sorrow and righteous concern. He did not waste time with whispers or rumors. He convened a meeting in the town hall, and the entire populace of Redemption, drawn by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and respect for his power, crammed into the small, stuffy building. He stood before them, a tall, imposing figure dressed in a severe black suit, his silver hair catching the light from the dusty windows. When he spoke, his voice was a resonant, powerful instrument, filled with a false piety that was as smooth and convincing as it was utterly hollow. He masterfully, cruelly, manipulated the townspeople's deepest fears and most ingrained prejudices. He spoke of his bride, Seraphina, his voice thick with a feigned, paternalistic sorrow. He painted a picture of a mentally unstable and ungrateful young woman, a delicate creature prone to wild fits of hysteria. He chose his words with the precision of a surgeon, conveniently highlighting what he called her fiery and unpredictable Mexican blood, a subtle but potent poison that he dripped into the ears of the predominantly white, Anglo-Saxon townsfolk. He implied that her wildness and dishonesty were an inherent part of her nature, a tragic flaw that he, in his Christian charity, had tried to tame through the sacred bonds of matrimony. Then, he turned his attention to Elias Thorne. He portrayed the reclusive veteran as a dark, violent force, a war-addled man whose mind had been broken by the horrors he had witnessed. He suggested, with a grave and sorrowful tone, that this disturbed and dangerous man had found his poor, hysterical bride wandering in the storm and, in his madness, had kidnapped her, holding her captive in his remote, isolated cabin. He was not just a kidnapper, Croft implied. He was a predator who had taken advantage of a frightened, confused woman. Croft's performance was brilliant, a chilling symphony of lies and manipulation. He preyed on their fear of the outsider, their suspicion of the man who lived alone, the man who carried the invisible scars of a brutal war. He offered a massive reward for Seraphina's safe return and for the capture of the dangerous madman who held her. The sum he named was staggering, enough to change the life of any homesteader or shopkeeper in the room. In an instant, he turned every citizen into a potential bounty hunter, their greed a powerful new weapon in his personal arsenal. He appealed to their sense of order, their need for a simple story with a clear hero and a clear villain. He was the grieving husband, the pillar of the community. Elias was the violent outsider, the threat to their peaceful way of life. The town sheriff, a weak and pliable man who owed his position entirely to the judge's patronage, was eager to please. He stood beside Croft, his chest puffed out, and officially deputized a posse of local men to ride out and rescue the judge's bride. The group that formed was a motley collection of the town's worst impulses. There were a few true believers, men who had been completely swayed by Croft's performance and saw themselves as righteous crusaders. There were the greedy opportunists, their eyes gleaming at the thought of the reward money. And then there were the others, the majority, the men who were simply too afraid to defy a man as powerful and influential as Judge Croft. The law, in the town of Redemption, had ceased to be a shield for the innocent. It had become nothing more than a club to be wielded in a powerful man's personal vendetta. But in the back of the crowded room, there was one dissenting voice, though it remained unspoken. Doc Miller, the town's elderly physician, stood with his arms crossed, his face a grim mask of disgust. Doc Miller was a man who had seen too much of the world to be fooled by a polished performance. He had set Elias's shattered leg after the war, had spent long hours with the quiet, broken soldier, and had developed a grudging respect for the man's stoicism and his deep, abiding sense of honor. He had also, on more than one occasion, been called to the Croft ranch to treat a servant or a ranch hand who had accidentally fallen down a flight of stairs, and he had seen the cold, cruel darkness that lurked beneath the judge's veneer of respectable piety. He saw through Croft's charade, and what he saw chilled him to the bone. That night, under the cover of a moonless, starless sky, Doc Miller made a decision. He saddled his old, sway-backed mare and rode out of town, taking the lonely, winding trail that led towards Elias Thorne's ranch. He had to warn him. He had to tell him that the entire town was being mobilized against him, that the law itself was riding at his door. But Judge Croft's paranoia was as absolute as his power. He had left Cale and Marcus behind to watch the town, to ensure that his carefully constructed narrative remained unchallenged. They saw the old doctor ride out, and they followed him, their horses moving like silent shadows in the darkness. They intercepted him on a lonely stretch of trail, miles from any help. They did not kill him. A dead man could be a martyr. A broken man was a message. They beat him savagely, with a cold, impersonal brutality, leaving him broken and bleeding in the dirt. They scattered his horse and his medical bag, a clear and terrifying warning to anyone else in Redemption who might consider defying the judge. News of the doctor's beating traveled through the town like a prairie fire, a chilling, whispered testament to Judge Croft's reach and his absolute ruthlessness, the last glimmer of hope for any outside help, for any voice of reason or justice, was extinguished. A few days later, a fur trapper, a grizzled old mountain man who owed Elias a favor for a past kindness, made a wide detour on his way to his trap lines. He rode up to the ranch, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and grim resolve. He told Elias and Serafina everything. He told them of the judge's arrival, of the town hall meeting, of the lies that had been spun, of the posse that was being formed, and he told them what had happened to Doc Miller. As they listened to the trapper's story, the true, horrifying nature of their predicament settled over them. They were utterly and completely alone. The world had not just forgotten them, it had actively turned against them. They were marooned, abandoned by the very concept of law and community. The stark, terrifying realization did not break them. It did not crush their spirits. Instead, it solidified their bond into something as hard and unbreakable as forged steel. They looked at each other, the trapper's grim words hanging in the air between them, and in that shared glance, they saw the same unwavering resolve. They had no one left but each other. They were a nation of two, standing against the entire world. The night before the posse was set to ride, the air in the small cabin was thick and heavy with a palpable sense of doom. They had done everything they could to prepare. The rifles were loaded and laid out, a small arsenal of defiance. The barrels of water were full. Every angle of approach had been considered, every contingency planned for. The soldier in Elias had prepared the battlefield. But they both knew, with a silent, chilling certainty, that the dawn might very well be their last. Fear was a cold, living thing in the room with them, a third presence that sat in the shadows and watched them with hollow eyes. But they refused to give it a voice. To speak of their fear would be to give it power, to surrender to the overwhelming odds that were stacked against them. Instead, in the final, precious hours of peace they had left, they sought comfort and solace in each other. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, checking the action on the Winchester for the 10th time. She came and sat beside him, her presence a small, warm comfort in the cold. Tense silence. He put the rifle down and took her hand in his. His thumb began to stroke the back of her knuckles, a slow, steady, reassuring rhythm. She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of love, sorrow, and a fierce, unwavering loyalty that was as profound as any vow. In that moment, words were useless, inadequate things. The grand, sweeping speeches of poets and lovers had no place here, in this small, besieged cabin on the edge of the world. Their story was written not in words, but in shared glances, in silent acts of courage, in the desperate, profound truth of their connection. He stood up, gently pulling her to her feet. He led her to the cot, their bed for what might be their last night on earth. They made love, slowly and tenderly, with a quiet, desperate reverence. It was not an act of frantic, fleeting passion, not an attempt to escape the fear that gnawed at the edges of their minds. It was a deliberate, profound affirmation of life, in the very face of imminent, violent death. They chose to embrace the most vital, life-affirming connection they had. It was an act of defiance, a testament to the fact that even if the world intended to burn them to the ground, they were, in this moment, intensely and beautifully alive. Every touch, every kiss, was both a greeting and a goodbye. It was a desperate, beautiful, and tragic celebration of the love they had found against all odds, a love that had blossomed in the encroaching darkness. They clung to each other through the long, dark hours of the night, two solitary souls who had found their final, most honest sanctuary in one another's arms, waiting for the dawn. Dawn broke with a brutal, indifferent majesty, painting the eastern sky in harsh, unforgiving shades of red and orange, like the raw edges of a fresh wound against the bruised blue of the fading night. The world held its breath, waiting. The attack began not with a shout or a warning, but with the sharp, sickening crack of a rifle shot. The bullet struck the heavy wood of the cabin doorframe, inches from Elias's head, sending splinters flying with an angry hiss. It was the sound of an end. The posse, led by Judge Croft and his two grim enforcers, Cale and Marcus, had surrounded the ranch. From the windows of the cabin, Elias and Serafina could see their dark forms moving through the gray light, shadowy figures on the perimeter, rifles held at the ready. The initial shot was the signal, and then the air exploded into a chaotic, terrifying cacophony. Gunfire erupted from every direction, the sharp reports of rifles and pistols echoing across the valley. Men shouted orders, curses, and battle cries. The terrified livestock in the corrals, caught in the sudden storm of violence, began to bellow and stampede, their panicked cries adding to the overwhelming din. The siege had begun. There was no romance in this violence, no glory in the grim reality of the fight. It was desperate, ugly, and deeply personal. Elias, the weary rancher, was gone, burned away by the heat of the moment. In his place, the soldier emerged, cold and precise, his movements honed by years of brutal experience. He moved with deadly efficiency through the small cabin, a whirlwind of calculated action. He fired from different windows, never staying in one place for long, making their small home a difficult, elusive target. His shots were not wild or wasteful. They were carefully aimed, not necessarily to kill, but to wound, to demoralize, to show the posse that this would not be an easy fight, that their lives would be dearly bought. He targeted the legs of horses, the shoulders of men, choosing his moments with a grim patience. The air inside the cabin grew thick and acrid with the smell of gunpowder, dust, and fear, a metallic tang that coated their throats. Serafina, too, was transformed. The terrified, vulnerable woman who had stumbled from the storm was gone, replaced by a soldier in her own right. She was not paralyzed by fear. Instead, she was energized by a primal, fierce need to protect their shared life, their fragile future. She moved with a purpose born of desperation, working alongside Elias with a synchronized grace, her movements a mirror of his own grim determination. Her hands, which had once trembled with fear, were now steady as she loaded the spare rifles, cycling fresh cartridges into the chambers with a focused intensity. She watched the blind spots from the opposite side of the cabin, her eyes scanning the landscape, calling out warnings in a voice that was clear and strong amidst the din of battle. "2 men to the west," she would cry, or "watch the barn. Elias." At one point, a posse member, emboldened by a lull in the firing, made a desperate rush for a side window, hoping to get a clear shot. He leaped from behind a low rise, rifle held high, a look of grim determination on his face. Without a moment's hesitation, Serafina raised the Winchester that Elias had taught her to use. She aimed, her breath held, her sight fixed on the charging figure, and she fired. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the sound echoing in the small room. The man cried out, a sharp, choked sound of pain, and clutched at his shoulder, stumbling back into cover, his rifle falling uselessly from his grasp. The act both horrified and empowered her. She had drawn blood. She had fired a weapon with intent to harm, and she had done it to defend her home, her life, their love. In the blistering heat of the battle, Judge Croft's carefully constructed mask of civility began to melt away, consumed by the inferno of his own rage. He had expected a quick, brutal end to this inconvenience, a simple reclamation of his property. The fierce, unyielding resistance from the cabin sent him into a spiraling fury. He began screaming at his men, his voice a high, unhinged shriek that cut through the sound of gunfire. His long-suppressed depravity, the vile, festering corruption beneath his pious facade, came pouring out in a torrent of verbal filth, his words echoing across the battlefield. "She's mine!" he shrieked, his face contorted with madness, loud enough for many in the posse to hear above the din. The land, the girl, it's all my property. I killed her whelp of a father for it, and I'll kill this broken soldier to get it back." This was the unholy truth, laid bare for all to witness. The words, raw and monstrous, sent a shockwave through the ranks of the townsmen. They had been led to believe they were on a righteous mission, rescuing a helpless woman from a deranged kidnapper, upholding the law. Now, they heard the confession of a murderer, a madman obsessed with possession. They were not crusaders, they were pawns in a personal vendetta, tools in a murderer's obsessive quest for power. Their enthusiasm for the fight visibly waned. The rhythm of their gunfire became less frequent, their shots less accurate, their collective resolve crumbling under the weight of Croft's horrifying confession. A few men exchanged uneasy glances. The righteousness had drained from their purpose, leaving behind only a bitter taste of complicity. Seeing his command dissolving, his posse faltering, and driven to the very edge of madness by the stubborn resistance and his own unhinged rage, Croft made a desperate, final, monstrous move. He lunged for a lantern hanging from one of the men's horses, ripping it free. With a wild, triumphant yell, he lit the wick and, with a powerful, arching throw, hurled the flaming lantern onto the dry, shingled roof of Elias's barn. The structure, filled with months of dried hay and tinder-dry wood, ignited with an explosive, whooshing roar. Flames leaped into the sky, a hungry, living thing, devouring the dry timbers with horrifying speed. A wave of intense heat washed over the entire ranch, searing their faces even inside the cabin. The fire, fanned by the relentless prairie wind, quickly spread from the barn, a fiery tendril reaching for the cabin itself. The posse members, those who had not already retreated, backed away, their faces a mixture of horror and disgust. This was no longer a fight, a capture, or even a rescue. This was an execution, an act of pure, unadulterated madness. Smoke began to pour through the floorboards, seeping through the bullet holes that riddled the walls of the cabin. The heat inside became unbearable, a suffocating, fiery embrace that stole the air from their lungs. They were trapped, caught between the raging inferno outside and the thick, choking smoke within. Elias was hit, a searing pain exploding in his side. A piece of shrapnel from a ricocheting bullet had torn a deep gash, and blood began to seep through his shirt. He pressed a rag to the wound, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He and Serafina were forced to the very center of the small room, coughing, their eyes streaming, unable to see clearly through the swirling haze. Death seemed not only inevitable but imminent. The roar of the flames was deafening, the crackle of burning wood the last sound they would ever hear. Through the haze, their eyes met. This was the end. "Serafina," he gasped, his voice ragged and raw, torn from his chest. "Finding you. It was the only part of my life that ever made sense." Tears streamed down her smoke-stained face, carving clean paths through the soot. "You taught me what it is to be loved," she choked out, her voice breaking with grief and fierce gratitude. "Not to be owned." They moved toward each other, through the smoke and the fire, for a final embrace, a final desperate connection before the world consumed them. As he reached for her, his foot slipped on a loose floorboard near the hearth, a small, unnoticed imperfection in the old wood. His eyes widened, suddenly fixed on the space beneath, the root cellar, a small, dark space under the house, where he stored his winter vegetables and other supplies. He had used it for years, and in the chaos of the siege, had completely forgotten its existence. It was a slim chance, a desperate gamble. At worst, it was a grave. At best, it was a miracle. "Down!" he yelled, his voice a hoarse shout against the roar of the fire. He lunged for the loose floorboard, tearing it up with a superhuman effort, revealing a dark, narrow opening into the earth. "Get down! Now!" He shoved her towards the black, gaping hole, the roar of the fire consuming the world around them, a hungry beast devouring their home. "Go! I'm right behind you," he promised, knowing even as the words left his lips that the spreading inferno and his bleeding wound made it a promise he might not be able to keep. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, her eyes wide with terror and a desperate hope, and then she disappeared into the suffocating darkness of the root cellar. He collapsed onto the wooden trapdoor, pulling it shut with the last of his strength, just as the main roof beam of the cabin gave way with a deafening crash, showering the room in a cascade of sparks and flame. They survived the inferno in the suffocating, earthy darkness of the root cellar. Time ceased to have meaning in the pitch-black void, measured only by the terrifying symphony of destruction playing out above them. They heard the hungry, roaring crescendo of the fire as it consumed their home, the sound of physical pressure against their ears. They felt the shuddering impact as the main roof beam collapsed, a thunderous crash that shook the very ground beneath them. Then, gradually, the roar subsided, replaced by a slow, agonizing diminuendo of cracking timbers and the sinister hiss of hot embers meeting damp earth. Eventually, an eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the faint, persistent crackle of the dying fire and the ragged sound of their own breathing in the close, smoky air. They clung to each other in the darkness, two souls entombed, waiting for a dawn they were not sure they would live to see. Hours later, a thin, gray light began to seep through the cracks in the hastily closed trapdoor. They emerged, pushing the heavy door open, into a world remade by fire and violence. The sun was rising, but its light brought no warmth, only a cruel illumination of the utter devastation that surrounded them. The cabin was gone, reduced to a blackened, smoldering skeleton of charred logs and ash. The barn was nothing more than a dark, smoking patch on the earth. The corrals were splintered and burned. The bodies of several posse members lay where they had fallen, stark, still shapes against the blackened ground. The pristine, beautiful landscape that had been Elias's sanctuary was now scarred and wounded, a perfect mirror of their own ravaged lives. They stood together, covered in soot and grime, in the heart of their own ruin. Their reprieve was brutally short-lived. A figure emerged from the swirling smoke and haze, stalking through the ruins like a vengeful specter. It was Judge Alistair Croft. His fine suit was torn and stained, his silver hair was wild and matted, and his face was a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He was kicking at the debris, his movements jerky and unhinged, searching for their bodies. He saw them as they climbed out of the cellar, and a triumphant, utterly insane grin spread across his face, a rictus of madness. He did not reach for a weapon. He lunged at them with a guttural roar, his hands outstretched like claws, all pretense of civilization burned away. The final confrontation was not a shootout between men of the West. It was a primitive, brutal struggle in the ashes of a home. Elias, weakened by his wound and the suffocating smoke, was at a severe disadvantage. The two men grappled, their bodies colliding with a sickening thud. They fell, rolling through the hot soot and embers, a desperate tangle of limbs and fury. Croft was a man possessed, his strength fueled by pure madness, his fingers gouging for Elias's eyes, his teeth bared in a snarl. Elias fought back with the grim tenacity of a cornered animal, but he was fading, the blood from the gash in his side seeping warmly through his makeshift bandage. It was Serafina who ended it. She did not scream or cower. She moved with a cold, clear purpose, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that was terrifying to behold. She scanned the ground, and her hand closed around a heavy, charred piece of timber from the ruined cabin. As Croft finally pinned Elias to the ground, his hand reaching for the pistol still holstered at his hip, Serafina acted. With a cry that was both a sob and a battle cry, she brought the heavy piece of wood down with all her might on Croft's outstretched arm. There was a sickening, wet crack, a sound that cut through the morning air. Croft screamed, a high, piercing shriek of pure agony, his arm shattering just below the elbow. The bone protruded from the skin at a grotesque angle. The opening was all Elias needed. He surged upwards, using the last of his strength to subdue the screaming, wounded man, pinning him to the ground. His forearm pressed hard against Croft's throat. Just then, a group of figures emerged from the edge of the burned-out clearing. It was the few remaining posse members, their faces a pale, haunted mixture of shame, horror, and a strange, grudging awe. They had seen and heard everything. They had seen the fire, they had heard Croft's mad confession, and now they saw the brutal, primitive aftermath of his obsession. The town sheriff, a pathetic, diminished figure, tried to regain some semblance of control, blustering as he approached, his own pistol drawn uncertainly. "Thorne," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, "you are under arrest for murder." But the spell was broken. The fear and authority that Croft and his puppet sheriff had wielded were gone, turned to ash along with the cabin. One of the townsmen, a burly blacksmith with soot on his face and a look of profound disgust in his eyes, took a slow step forward. He looked at the whimpering, broken judge, at the pathetic sheriff, and then at Elias and Serafina, standing defiant amidst their ruin. He turned his head and spat on the ground at the sheriff's feet, a gesture of ultimate contempt. "This man," the blacksmith said, his voice a low, rumbling growl as he gestured with his chin towards Elias, "defended his home, and that woman." He nodded to Serafina, who stood tall, her chest heaving, the charred club still clutched in her hand. "Defended her life. The only criminal here is the judge." The other men murmured in agreement, their voices a low, angry chorus of assent. They had been lied to, used, and made complicit in a madman's crimes. Their shame was now a hard, cold anger. They moved forward, ignoring the sheriff's weak protests. They roughly pulled Croft to his feet and bound his hands, his screams of pain and his wild, empty threats ignored. A raw, unwritten form of frontier justice, born of truth and fire, had been served. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of bleak, overwhelming silence. Elias and Serafina stood together, covered in soot and blood, amidst the total destruction of their world. They had survived, they had won, but they had nothing left. The physical and emotional toll was immense. They were homeless, wounded, and still, in the eyes of the world, outcasts. The social prejudice that had fueled the posse would not evaporate overnight. Even with the judge's downfall, they were alone in the truest sense of the word, standing on a piece of land that was now a graveyard of their past and the uncertain foundation of their future. But in the midst of that desolation, a small, unexpected glimmer of hope emerged. The blacksmith and a few of the other men who had turned against Croft approached them. They did not meet Elias's gaze, their own eyes fixed on the ground, their faces etched with a deep, profound shame. The blacksmith, acting as their spokesman, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Thorne," he mumbled, his voice thick with an emotion Elias couldn't quite place. We were wrong. What he told us, what we did, it was wrong." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Elias's. "We cannot undo it, but we can help you set it right." He gestured to the smoking ruins. "We have lumber, supplies. We have strong backs. We will help you rebuild." It was not an act of charity. It was an act of penance, an apology offered not in words, but in the promise of hard labor. It was a gesture of profound respect. In the crucible of the siege, they had finally seen Elias not as a threat, but as a man of unbreakable honor, and Serafina not as a hysterical runaway, but as a survivor of immense courage. It was a small, fragile crack in the town's thick wall of prejudice, the first, uncertain step toward healing. Weeks later, the frame of a new, smaller cabin stood on the footprint of the old one, the fresh, pale wood a stark contrast to the blackened earth around it. The work was hard, a slow and arduous process of creation in the wake of destruction. But Elias was not alone. The blacksmith and the other men from town came when they could, their quiet, steady presence a constant, unspoken apology. They worked alongside him, their shared sweat and labor a bridge across the chasm of suspicion that had once separated them. Serafina worked alongside them all, her spirit unbowed, her grief channeled into the hard, physical work of building their new future. She hammered nails, carried lumber, and mixed daub for the walls, her hands growing calloused and strong. The air of suspicion in the town had not vanished completely, but it was now challenged by a current of deep and abiding respect. The story of the siege had become a local legend, a tale of the reclusive soldier and the brave woman who had stood together against a monster and refused to be broken. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden, healing light over the valley, Elias and Serafina stood on the unfinished porch of their new home. The physical scars on both of them were beginning to fade into pale, thin lines, but the emotional ones, they knew, would always remain, a part of the landscape of their souls. He was no longer just a haunted recluse, a man hiding from the ghosts of his past. And she was no longer just a victim, a woman defined by the trauma she had endured. They were survivors. They were builders. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Their palms were rough and calloused from their shared work, their grip strong and sure. He looked out at the vast, wild landscape, the same jagged mountains and rolling plains that had once symbolized his profound isolation, but they no longer looked empty to him. "Our home," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with a profound and unshakable sense of peace. Serafina leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes tracing the purple line of the distant mountains as they drank in the last of the evening light. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but it was no longer empty. They had fought for this life, in this place. Their love, tested by fire and tragedy, was not a passionate, consuming flame, but a deep, solid, and enduring warmth, a hearth fire built to last through the longest winters. They had not found a perfect life, free from pain or memory, but they had built their own justice from the ashes, and in each other, they had found a hope more resilient, more real, and more beautiful than they ever could have imagined. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow Western enthusiasts. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.